we're now going to move through each of these chapters in turn. With each Arup, we're going to set out the key challenges and opportunities in each area. Then we'll ask Pippa, as I said, to be the voice of production and producing sanity as we move through, and Trisha will keep popping up to give us your questions too. So first, to production materials. Back to you, Devni. Based on your research, how can you, summarize the issues in this area?
Sure. I hope you can see my screen now. And before I kind of go into this, I do want to say that some of the current challenges that we talk about, they are quite broad brushing, and I know that it's not applicable in all cases, but we have tried to kind of reflect the general industry norms. So I'm sure that there is some amazing things happening, and we may have not captured that, but this is to just show the kind of more the broad industry practices as we know it. So production materials, what currently happens now? So the focus, as I mentioned before, is being quite a challenge, is this thing about artistic freedom and not being confined by any kind of sustainability confines or requirements. And that is pretty much the biggest challenge to overcome. Some other challenges include just having lots of kind of materials or costumes available at hand, at your fingertips, just in case you may need them or may not need them, but you might need them, and if you do, you can't wait another day to buy it, which means you need to have it so you don't delay any of the program. The other challenges around the separation of procurement budgets and strike budgets. And because these budgets are quite separate, there's no real incentive of thinking about the life cycle of the various materials that are coming through productions. People at the beginning plan for the beginning, people at the end plan for the end. And so, as I mentioned before, a life cycle approach to this is really needed. And finally, another challenge is that we spend a lot of time planning productions, but at the end, it's let's get out of here as quick as possible. And that kind of very short strike times perpetuates this culture of take, make, dispose, take, make, dispose. There doesn't seem to be enough time to kind of put this back into reuse networks. And so what are we proposing? So the three main areas is what you can see on screen there. And so the first is around reusing materials. So actually matching the supply with the demand of the set components, the costumes, the props, by using sharing platforms. And these sharing platforms will probably need to make use of warehouses for temporary storing materials that might not be using the props or costumes or at that given in moment in time, and really to use materials passports, which are either provided by a third-party service provider of this kind of reuse network. And materials passports are essential because they provide information about the specification of these materials, it's how it's been used and in which film productions it's already been used in and its current location. And this really can give productions confidence that it's fit for purpose and can be used in the production that you're planning for. Next up, we have buying virgin materials responsibly. So where you can't use reusable materials from these reuse networks, how can we source virgin materials as sustainably as possible? And how can we use more responsible suppliers who are very transparent about the impact of their supply chains, rather than, I don't know, quickly going onto eBay, finding the thing that can be delivered tomorrow to meet your needs. And by sustainable materials as well, what do we mean by that? It's about, if it is for something that's going to re-enter the reuse network, it needs to be durable and therefore reusable. But on the other hand, if it's something that's going to be used quite quickly, is it readily recyclable? Is it biodegradable? And then finally, resource efficient set construction. This is all about digital design. So you may have heard of the term parametric design, and this is the use of a design technique that looks at the available materials in a database, for example, and kind of matching what's available to as close as the design that you need, so you're not requiring new materials. Another part is around digital fabrication to reduce material use, for example, through 3D printing. But the fundamental kind of thing around resource efficient set construction is the need to design for deconstruction. How do you design a set today so that at the end of production it can be dismantled rather than kind of torn down and with the materials damaged in the process? And you can do this through using mechanical connections of a glue, but that does require a new approach to designing. And so what are the critical requirements? It is essentially a new approach to designing. So art departments need to think about what happens to their materials at the end of a production right from the start, and how kind of they can make use of these digital design and fabricate techniques in the process. There may be an opportunity to kind of create a new function or role that is solely there to actually dismantle sets carefully and slowly at the end, rather than kind of demolishing them to preserve their quality too. There's a need for third-party service providers that we're already seeing on the market, like Dress, to really take up this opportunity of providing reuse networks. And with that comes a need for space for warehouse storage in between in productions. And finally, as people working on productions, you can only buy sustainable materials if there are sustainable suppliers. So it's a call for people to take up that opportunity. Think about if you are a supplier, how can you be more sustainable in the materials that you use or the business models that you use? And that's it from me.
Cool, definitely. Just a quick question for you. You know, is this about progressing from where we are now, or to what is it should be considered a completely new way of working?
It's quite different to what we are now. I know there's some great things around the kind of end of the life cycle, so how production materials can go into charities or for schools, but there are lots of end of pipe thinking. We need to think from the beginning, and there's not really going to be a reuse network if there's no demand for those reusable materials from productions in the first place. So it is really about that front end thinking that we need to change.
Cool, thank you. We'll come on to planning, I think, later, which is the bit that sticks it all together. So, we've heard about recycling, responsible sourcing, while potentially more costly, don't seem beyond the imagination. But I guess what you're talking about here is asking all designers to think about the way that we design sets so they can be broken down, reused, before they've even thought about what they're designing. And it's worth pointing out here, we've got an event penciled in to focus on that specifically, because how many people in the industry are thinking about parametric design tools? I don't think many currently. So we've got an event with designers later on this year. Pippa, bringing you back in here as the voice of reason, how do you feel about asking your designers to build sets out of a potentially pre-approved list of materials? And what about any financial implications that might come along with that?
Yeah, well, I think, I think to an extent people have been doing this, certainly in my experience, working with someone like Eve Stewart when she was designing the sets of Call the Midwife for us, she was reusing the sets of Les Miserables. That might be news to the producers of Les Miserables, but she and a lot of designers do this regularly. But where it's difficult, I think, for individuals is clearly you're not in a position, she's not in a position, I'm not in a position to store sets. So I think it's crucial that we get buy-in from the studios, so that the studios here, both the actual physical studios like Leavesden and Pinewood and so on, are providing spaces where set materials can be stored, but also the people who have a throughput of productions, so the funding studios, are supporting this as well. Because an individual producer or an individual designer is probably only going to work on a handful of productions across a 5-year period. And that's not going to make this change. It needs to be happening through lots of productions which are going on, you know, the whole time, and you can only really get that by getting a buy-in from the studios and and getting their support.
Thank you. And I guess the key message as well, you know, how we like to frame stuff at Albert is that this is an opportunity, not an imposition. So there's no reason why, you know, shrewd, financially minded organisations wouldn't find a way to turn a profit on this. Trisha, I just wonder if we can check in with you, see if there's any questions right now.
So many questions. I mean, so many questions. So I apologise if we don't get to all of them, and some of the questions that came before the event as well. But one, Clive has asked specifically, so this is a sort of sub questions of what you've just been talking about. How much work has been done to actually look at the new material products that will replace the traditional materials which don't lend themselves to either, I guess, multiple use or recycling? I mean, I know we've seen some case studies of that because we've done sustainable Sept events ourselves as Albert in the past, and we've seen incredible case studies of things that are happening. But definitely, do you get the sense that there are new materials coming onto the market to deal with this demand?
I think the demand is definitely growing, and I think the suppliers are seeing the demand is growing, and therefore kind of making sure that their business is aligned to that demand. We are seeing new materials, and I think there's like definitely a growing use of, especially in the construction industry, timber where it is applicable, and I'm sure Tim can kind of talk about that. But what is really missing is the kind of the critical mass. And I think you mentioned before that it's currently still slightly expensive because it's not the industry norm, and that demand isn't sufficient to kind of make it kind of financially favorable. Tim, I don't know whether you had anything to kind of add to that.
Yeah, and I guess it's coming back to the point you made about materials that are used on a short term, and there's a lot more research being done on the idea of what are called biological products, so things that are sort of grown rather than made in factories. So we get sort of plant-based plastics, that kind of thing. You know, if we can grow the materials that we're using for sets rather than making them in factories, then the end of life question becomes a lot more easy to address in terms of being able to recycle or send them back into the natural cycle, maybe. So that's an area of potential growth, I think, the use of more biological projects.
Well, somebody's asked a question actually specifically, which I think alludes to that, is, has there been consideration in your report when you've done this analysis to, so this is Candice, thank you Candice, in order to understand of effectively disposing of single-use items like that when they're made from plant-based projects, even if they appear to be more eco-friendly. So have we been able to weigh up in this report the environmental impact of perhaps disposing of your more environmentally friendly items like you know, plant-based plastics, for example?
So we didn't do that specifically in this project, and I'd like to kind of add it was the waste management data that was quite limited in what we received. So in terms of kind of analysing options for better waste management, I think that was for us a gap that we really saw. And I think I think I'll come onto it in a little bit, but there is a need for kind of industry-wide waste signage that wherever you go, you kind of know which specific materials can be kind of put in which sort of storage and therefore sent over to appropriate. So as Tim was mentioning, if we're using biological materials like mycelium, making sure that even though it looks like cardboard potentially, people know to put it in the organic waste bin.
So more rules to enable greater freedom. I guess that's the the underlying thing.